Hey everybody, welcome to the Wonder Lab. I'm Tim Moriarty. Today we are thrilled to have Brett Robison with us. Brett is the Associate Director of Outreach at the McGrath Institute for Church Life at Notre Dame. He holds a background in marketing and English from Notre Dame and a PhD in mass communication from the University of Georgia. He's the author of Appletopia, Media Technology and the Religious Imagination of Steve Jobs. In this episode, we dive into topics like surviving the digital apocalypse, the timeless ideas of Marshall McLuhan, Donald Trump's media strategy, and practical approaches for staying grounded in today's tech-driven world. If you enjoy this conversation, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for tuning in. All right, Brett, how you doing?
Good, Tim. It's good to see you.
Good to see you as well. Good to see you as well. So I've actually been curious to talk to you about this class you're teaching this year. What is it? Surviving the Digital Apocalypse?
Surviving the Digital Apocalypse, yes. This is the first time we're teaching it here at Notre Dame. It's part of our Technology and Digital Studies program in the College of Arts and Letters. And I've been thinking about a course like this for a while, probably 25 years, and finally get to teach it. And I was very surprised and grateful that the chair of the program was very interested in it. In fact, he was the one who suggested we make the title even more provocative than what I had, which was something a little more mundane. But as a former marketer, I appreciated the instinct and went for it with the title. And we're really just trying to understand what's happening under digital conditions, using apocalypse in the kind of Greek sense of something's being revealed. So not necessarily the world is ending, but there is a revelation afoot around big questions about what it means to be human, how our perception is shifting under these conditions, and ultimately what that means about our own faith and beliefs.
What do you, in terms of your approach to this class, when you talk about something's being revealed, what is it about a new medium coming into the culture that tends to be a moment of revelation? So just, thinking about what is it that the printing press revealed? What is it that electronic forms of communication revealed? So I'm curious about this question of what's invisible, and then how do things become visible? What is it that we take for granted? What's the water we're swimming in, and how is it that new technologies kind of are these moments of revelation about maybe something that we weren't aware of when we're in the midst of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way I look at technology is very similar to the way that Marshall McLuhan, the Canadian media theorist, looked at it, which was to say that technology is not some kind of alien force or artifact that kind of drops in on us and we have to kind of adapt as a species or something like this, but rather it's an extension of ourselves and an extension of our existing faculties and powers and abilities. And the irony, I suppose, in this process is that when we extend ourselves in a form other than ourselves, we don't always recognize it as ourselves immediately. And so when we have a new tool, or I should say a new environment that's created with a new media technology, if we're paying attention and if we're looking at it in this kind of McLuhan-esque way of looking at these dynamics, both psychological and social, that there are patterns that reveal something about ourselves. So if you look at the printing press, for example, this was an extension in many ways of human speech and thought, right? So what used to be oral, something we would speak into the air and then it would be gone, could now be captured, which we also did with writing and scribal culture, but it could also be mass produced. And so when you mass produce something, as we know today in the modern age, you homogenize it. So things come off the press exactly like the previous thing off the press, and you can make as many copies as you'd like. And this begins to shape not just book printing and the growth in literacy, but the economy and politics, that this idea that we can mass produce products and that we can create, nations around these sort of economic powers that mass production allows. So the printing press changes the environment, and then we as the humans in that environment, using this extension of our own abilities, we begin to change in certain ways, the ways we think, the ways we pattern our thought, the ways we conduct our politics, the ways we construct markets, all flow or stem from these innovations. And so that's very revealing to me, to look at it from that perspective about this relationship that's often unspoken or maybe unacknowledged between the technological environments and then the proliferation of a new culture.
I think it's fascinating. What is your own journey in this? Like, how did you get interested in looking at media communications, looking at the question of this whole approach to looking at culture through the lens of McLuhan? What's your own? I'm just kind of curious what your own trajectory and when these questions kind of came to the fore for you.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of a child of the 80s, and I'm thinking about Carlo Acutis and his interest in computers and the things of his age, and I was the same way as a kid. I mean, I had an Atari, that was the extent of video games back then, but we got a personal computer when I was in high school, and I found that to be fascinating. And it was only in college when the internet and email really became, commercially available and popular. So in grad school in the late 90s, I joined a little fledgling group at the University of Georgia called the New Media Institute, and we were graduate students and faculty really trying to push the edge of what was happening in digital technology at the time. So we built this Wi-Fi network over Athens, Georgia, which in 1999 was kind of unheard of. We used Pringles cans and antennas to do this, and so nobody had mobile devices back then, but we had these little PDAs, compact iPACs, that could hook up to a Wi-Fi network, and we would send people into coffee shops and test this thing. I just thought it was really fascinating. This whole new, culture was growing up around, myself. I was in my early 20s looking for work and a career, and so this really kind of turned my trajectory in the digital direction. And so I taught in the New Media Institute for a while. But I guess what caught my attention the most was the director of our institute was this very charismatic guy who built this kind of cult following around this new technology stuff. And I got really interested in that dynamic and ended up writing a book later on when I did my PhD about Steve Jobs, another charismatic kind of cult figure that kind of rode the back of technology to this cultural phenomenon. And I saw a resemblance there between this mentor of mine in the late 90s and what Steve Jobs was doing. And it was around that time, as I reflected more deeply on what was happening and becoming more interested again in my faith, that I started to see some cracks or fissures in trying to reconcile the two. That if people have this kind of religious devotion to technology, what does that do to their true religious devotion or religious sensibilities? And so that was 20 years ago, and I've been thinking about that ever since.
On your end, there's a kind of like a reversal where were you part of sort of a kind of the techno optimism of the 80s, where you thought this stuff was really going to transform us and make life better? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I thought, I don't know, computing in the 90s or late 80s, early 90s it was so mundane, right? Like you took courses in school and it was like basic language and programming language. And so there wasn't the sort of sexiness or excitement that I think really, really took root in the late 90s when, as I said, I was in grad school. And that's when, being surrounded by people who were very enthusiastic about it, you just got the sense that this was a wave that was coming and there was no stopping it, and you might as well get on board. And that's kind of how I felt as someone who was interested in making films and documentaries. And I thought, man, the media landscape is changing. In some ways, this is really cool because someone like me who 20 years ago would have needed all sorts of capital and money and connections to make a film can like go with a little digital camera and post something on the internet, and maybe do it that way. So there was something very democratizing and exciting about it. So yeah, I wouldn't say it was totally utopian, but I saw that energy in it, and I was kind of following that wave. But then I started reading more in this area, just historically, technological change, cultural change, some of the mistakes we've made in the past, and I thought, oh man, this is going to break the other way eventually, and so I started bracing for that, and that's really become the subject of my study is the kind of the blowback.
Right, right. Is there, would you say, in terms of your own like intellectual journey, is there like a central, I guess, orienting question that kind of motivates all of your current academic work?
Yeah, so I guess it's kind of a both and answer. I'm infinitely interested and curious about all the different tangents that this topic leads to, but I suppose on the other hand, I have this very singular interest in the relationship between technology and religion, religious belief and religious practice. I think they're intimately related in the sense that anything that changes our perception of the world, of reality, our experience of the interior life, which I think is especially acute under digital conditions, is endlessly fascinating to me, and also an area of concern as a father of 5 kids and someone who works in pastoral and academic outreach here at Notre Dame. When you look at these trends, whether it's young people leaving the church, or on the other hand, people becoming more religious or spiritual in other ways, maybe not in traditionally Christian ways, but certainly spiritual interest abounds. I'm drawn to the idea that a lot of this is a product of our technological environment. And you mentioned the printing press. You can obviously see the corollaries there with the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment. All of these movements have, in some sense, some of their genesis in the dominant technology of that time.
Right. So on that point, I mean, I kind of want to get into some questions about like McLuhan, questions about even critiques of McLuhan in terms of him being accused of being a technological determinist in a way. But I guess before we do that, a lot of people may not even know who he is, and it might be useful to just do a quick, overview of who this guy was and what is this key insight, this medium is the message.
Yeah, so McLuhan was a Canadian academic professor, some would say philosopher of media, but he started this is back in the 30s and 40s, in literary study, literature. So he was at Cambridge. He was very interested in poetry and in the poetic form, and the seeds of his ideas about media really grew out of his understanding of literature. And his dissertation was on the classical trivium, so grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And that's when he started to develop this idea that different ages have a different emphasis in terms of how, for him, it was how education happened or how literature developed. So he was looking at the way in which in some ages grammar was sort of the way, was more dominant, right? So you can think about Augustine in the 4th century and the sort of grammar or language of creation, the way he looked at scripture, the way he looked at nature. It was very much a grammarian, like looking at the structure of things and the meaning of things, and that individual things and words have meaning and so on. But then you see the shift in like the 12th, 13th century towards logic and dialectic and the scholastics and this kind of thing. And then he would say, I think in the Elizabethan age, it was more about rhetoric and so on. So he saw these ascendancies in different ways of reading and also expressing the imagination in the world. And so from that kind of literary, more humanities-based perspective, he saw this as he was growing in his career in the 60s and 70s, something happening in media with electric media, really moving the book off center stage. And so this man of letters, this man of the book, was watching this revolution transformation happen and decided to pivot in his academic career to focus on media. And he was kind of roundly mocked by other academics, especially in literature, who saw this as unserious. But he was looking at everything from advertisements to radio programs to the technologies themselves as the new forms, the new poetry, the new grammar of the age. And so in order to understand the age, you have to understand those things. So he took those things very seriously. And he was also very Catholic. He was a convert. He converted when he was at Cambridge. And it was a big part of his life. He went to daily mass when he was at the University of Toronto at St. Michael's College. And it shaped his thought in a lot of, I think, underappreciated ways. There's a really good book called The Medium and the Light, which is a collection of his reflections and letters and essays on religion. But as a young academic myself, this really resonated to that question I mentioned earlier, which is the relationship between technology and religion. So McLuhan would, I think, break history into these four, but I think we've added the fifth. But you start with the oral, the original kind of human communication technology native to us as speaking beings, and then scribal, when we start to write things down, and then print, which would be the mechanization of scribal, really the mechanization of written language and printed language, and then electric, which would be turn of the 20th century. We get into telegraph, telephone, radio, film, television, and then in the last 30 years, digital. And so he breaks history into these moments because he sees a very direct tie between the modes by which we communicate and the patterns of thought and consciousness that emerge in these cultures. And it's kind of instinctive and common sense if you think about it, that whatever mode by which we're communicating is really going to shape the way we think. So, the legal tradition, for example, is very, very rooted in print, because you had to have laws that were printed and codified and stored and shared. Prior to that, though, in an oral culture, you wouldn't have this sort of thing for law. So you would have something like, the wisdom of the tribe, the sort of proverbial or proverb as the way to, adjudicate things in terms of appealing to higher wisdom. These would be oral traditions that were passed down and would become the basis for things like law and governance and so on. So that's a different mode than, say, print. And so something like the alphabet, which seems like, that's a technology. I mean, that's a way of taking spoken language, breaking it into basically into these these sounds, right, that mean nothing. A, ah, b, ba. Like, these don't mean anything. It's the combination of them. And so what McLuhan would say is, look, these are patterns. Like, this creates a pattern of thought. Not even so much like literate versus illiterate, but an alphabet is inherently fragmentary. So you're taking pieces and you're putting those pieces together. And so our brains begin to adapt, right, to this code, which is based on these individual sounds that are combined, and also something visual when you get to print, which is now knowledge is something that we consume visually and so on. So these habits of perception, these modes by which we not just speak but think, right? They have patterns embedded in them that shape the way we think. So we mentioned the printing press. You can look at a printing press layout, like the typeset with the little metal letters and so on, and then look at a overhead map of a city, and you can see the same pattern, this grid-like pattern that is unconsciously kind of formed by the media environments that we inhabit. If you look at an oral culture, you look at a village, it's typically in a circle. Why? Mm-hmm. Because sound travels in a circle. It has a center and it travels 360 degrees. So you begin to pattern architecture and the structure of cities and all of these things, which we don't typically associate with communication technologies explicitly, as the sort of patterning force or pattern for cultural development. And you mentioned earlier determinism. I mean, I think McLuhan would bristle at that term. He never said, that this causes that. Rather, what he says is our unawareness of this dynamic is us being a little determinist. I mean, it's us sort of falling into that determinist trap, when in fact, if you apply his method of thinking about this and you're aware and conscious of these patterns, then it's not determinist at all. You have freedom and agency in how these things develop.
What do you think? So like, Christ, in the whole Christian story, Christ becomes incarnate in a particular place. It's post alphabet. Even in the Gospel of John, there's the use of the word, the logos. What could Christ have become incarnate, let's say, prior to the alphabet, or was all of this necessary? So I guess the question is the whole kind of the whole move towards a kind of linear patterning of reality through which McLuhan, it seems to be saying, came to us through the alphabet. Is that it seems like that was sort of essential to the whole Christian story and even theology that develops in the first decades and centuries after Christ. And then I guess that's question number one. And then what happens if we now are sort of in a new phase where we're kind of leaving some of those values behind? What happens to this whole tradition, which in ways kind of grew up in a context that was in a way formed by these the technology of print? I don't know if that question makes sense, but I just would be curious to know your thoughts on the sense that Christ becomes flesh in this particular time of history, and that the last 2,000 years the religion has grown up in a context that's radically different from the one we're in now in terms of the technology we use and the way we're starting to process information in radically different ways. What is that? What are the implications of that?
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of I think it's Benedict's Regensburg address,
Yeah,
where he
exactly.
talks about the relationship between the emergence of kind of Greco-Roman civilization and the incarnation of Christ as being kind of coupled in a certain way historically and necessary. Yeah, I mean, if you read some of the McLuhan type scholars on this, I mean, the alphabet, because it was a mode by which we could abstract things, that we could create abstract symbols that could then be reassembled to mean something, that paved the way for something like monotheism. Like, you needed that move intellectually or structurally in human thought and speech or at that time writing. Yeah, I think I always refer in my class to the Phaedrus, this dialogue in Plato with Socrates and Lysias talking about writing and how writing things down, while it looks like a gift and a new really helpful tool, it can also lead to things like the loss of memory because we stop remembering because we're writing. It gives people the appearance of wisdom who don't have wisdom because they're just reading it off a page. And so that Greek oral tradition is very important to the philosophy that grew out of that civilization. But it was in this interesting period of transition where writing was part of the culture, and so that it was this. And I think we're living through a similar moment in which we're in transition, which is where a lot of the confusion comes from. I like when people ask, would Jesus have appeared on television? I do a lot, and my answer is always no, because he didn't come now. Like, if he wanted to be on television, he would have come now, and not to your question. Like, he came at a particular time for providential reasons that we can't fully understand. But yeah, the concept of the logos, which fits so well, which comes out of that kind of Greek world. So yes, the timing was fortuitous in God's great wisdom and eternal plan. It redeems paganism, which was very much part of the oral culture, literally listening to oracles and the voices of the different gods and these kind of things. So these different modes create different conditions, as I said, and patterns of attention and perception that are either, I suppose, more amenable or hospitable to something like the Christian message or less. And so I think the moment we're living in is one that, I think requires deeper thought and analysis about whether these conditions are amenable. Now, the kind of, I suppose, less nuanced approach would be to say, well, the internet is here, AI is here, let's just flood it with Christian messages, and then we're doing our job, and
Right.
and I think that's too simplistic. I think if we're not attending to these forms and the ways in which they're forming perception, then we're not ultimately going to be able to address the bigger question of evangelization.
To that point, I mean, McLuhan, he was criticized by folks for not making valued judgments. And then you read, though, Medium
In the light.
in the light, it seems like in his personal correspondence he was. I mean, there's one quote where he says, electronic information environments being utterly ethereal fostered the illusion of the world as a spiritual substance. It's now a reasonable facsimile of the mystical body, a blatant manifestation of the Antichrist. After all, the prince of this world is a very great electric engineer. I mean, that's pretty strong language.
Yeah. So, yeah, he was very defensive about whether or not he was moralizing or being utopian or dystopian. He would always say that it's really about understanding. It's not about I think he said something like making moral judgments about technology is the stance of the technological idiot. Like you're just reacting, and you don't actually understand these deeper dynamics, and only then can you maybe begin to talk about ethics. So yeah, and then yet privately he would say, for example, people would say, why don't you just throw out your television? Because he was a man of letters, a man of the book, and he said it wouldn't matter. Like when you live in a television culture, the culture itself has been transformed in such a way that it doesn't matter whether there's a television in your home or not, or whether I carry a smartphone or not. We are all digital now, and there's no escaping that. So for him, it was always about awareness. But I think because of the climate, especially in the 70s, around academics and and the relationship to faith, which was seen as kind of the unserious part, that he was more guarded about making those statements publicly. But as you said, they're in letters, they're in correspondence, and that one's really striking. And I don't know. I've thought more about this as I've talked to people in the AI world and the digital world and Silicon Valley culture, and writing the book on Jobs, and this whole weird relationship between what was the counterculture, which was very much about this new age, this new enlightenment, this expansion of consciousness via things like psychedelics and a lot of esoteric kind of occult practices. A lot of these technology builders, developers, if you go to Silicon Valley today and you were to hang out with some of these people, you would probably be invited to some psychedelic retreat. This still goes on. It's still part of the culture. It's still part of how they believe they come up with these really innovative, creative ideas. But if you go back to Thomas Edison, I mean, if you've ever been to his in Menlo Park, but there's paintings, weird sort of like Rosicrucian symbolism,
Right.
and when electricity was new, one of the hopes was they could communicate with the dead. I mean, this is one of the things they thought they were doing, and so you see this huge boom in kind of spiritualist occult practices in the late 1800s, early 1900s, having seances, and if you think about the seance, it's kind of funny to think about now, but how did you communicate with these spirits? They would often like knock, right? Like, if you're there, that's Morse code. Like that was the code or the mode by which people, the new technology, the new mysterious, ethereal, disembodied spiritual technology. And I don't think that's ever left us. I think there's this like kind of spiritual undercurrent in all of these pursuits, right? That if you're a transhumanist, you're Gnostic, you're trying to escape the body, you're trying to escape materiality. And so you're creating these virtual ephemeral experiences where you can just be pure mind, pure consciousness. So yeah, I've become more and more, maybe it's my curmudgeonliness or something, but like I just feel like, okay, well, are we all then, I'm carrying around a device that literally has the symbol of the forbidden fruit on the back of it, Satan's little victory at the beginning of creation. And are we just all participating in an occult ritual? When we're calling upon. Are we any different than the pagans who were calling upon oracles to tell them, when I type in my prompt to ChatGPT and I get this, non-human response, right? That seems to have knowledge and wisdom attached to it or something, at least knowledge and certainly information. But I think that's what he was poking at, and I think it's become more apparent today because, as you said, we are seeing more of these weird kind of, more people into witchcraft, into New Age spirituality. I think, again, this is all related to this technological environment.
You can trace the rise of modern science back to just this resurgence of interest in alchemy. The fact that like Isaac Newton was as interested in alchemy as he was chemistry. It seems like there's a fundamentally different way of looking at the world. So, like a Christian has this perspective of grace, where you're receiving a gift, you're contemplating what is, whereas technology, whether it's a sort of spiritual technology, if you're doing a rain dance, you're trying to do something to get something. You're trying to sort of use some sort of technique in order to get something you want. And it seems that at the beginning of modern science, there's also this sense of I'm going to be pulling levers to get this, and one works better than the other, and so one seemed to be the focus. Newton is known for being the great modern scientist rather than an alchemist. But if alchemy had worked better, then so I don't know, what is the spirit behind this, and does it tie into ancient, a kind of pagan notion of religion, which is somewhat transactional almost.
I just finished a reading group where we read Francis Bacon's The New Atlantis. So this would be like 17th century, explorers discovering this civilization that's got super advanced technology, but no one knows about them. Somehow they've remained hidden on the earth. And there's weird Christian allusions in it, but they're not. But it seems to be almost like it could be satire, it could be parody of religion. These people reference religion, but they also have these very bizarre, almost pagan ceremonies. But they have, and it's really, the text is held up because Bacon predicted a lot of the technology. Like they had chimeras, and they had genetic experimentation, and they had these new energy technologies, and so. And this is 300-400 years ago that he's writing this. So certainly in the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, this was part of the thinking. Like on the one hand, you had Christian scientists who still lived in that milieu of Christian or Reformation Christianity, but also saw science as this kind of source of truth that in some ways maybe had to be, maybe religion had to be edited or reconciled with these new discoveries. And so, I don't know how far back it goes. I can't imagine. I suppose in some ways, the pre-modern mind had a more holistic view of nature and spirituality and technology than we do. I think our sort of modern reductive approach is less enlightened in a lot of ways than some of the people that were thinking about these things in the 10th, 11th century even, and this is what I think Pope Francis is trying to recover and retrieve in documents like Laudato Si, this kind of interconnectedness, this cosmic consciousness. The new encyclical on the Sacred Heart has several references to technology in it. So it's good to hear the church, being very explicit about technology, but also trying to understand it in light of our tradition, and not just the social tradition, but things like why would AI be in an encyclical about the Sacred Heart? I mean, it's just a really interesting, and of course, the answer is because he's making a case for the heart. As being kind of the core of our being, of our identity, of our reality and relationship with God. And so our union between our hearts, the Sacred Heart, Divine Heart, is a dynamic at the heart of humanity that has to, if it's fully understood, then actually that gives us the resources and tools to think about technology in ways that are more productive, I think.
That's really, I actually really struck by that, where you kind of, the whole, especially that one part where he talks about the algorithm will never understand these certain, the fork making the indentation on the pie, and these sort of really beautiful, sort of poetic moments to our life that you can't actually, like a machine would never be able to understand, because it's a kind of understanding that comes from the heart, not from just, calculations.
And I think we have to take it a step further, because I think what ends up happening is we get locked in on, what does the technology do, and does that thing it does, is that good or bad? And then that's how we evaluate our technologies. And what we tend to miss in that analysis is like what it's doing to us, right? So how it's changing us and our perception. So if we're, going back to Socrates and the worries about writing, with AI, if we are outsourcing decision making, that means you're not doing as much critical thinking, you're not doing as much sort of practice of reason and so on, prudence, virtue, then it creates the conditions for the atrophy of that sense or of that ability or that faculty or that power. That's McLuhan's point. You extend something to kind of do it for you, and then your own ability to do that begins to atrophy. So that to me is the longer term worry about things like AI, not so much that AI, will start a war or something, although that's, also possible, but just the act of outsourcing human decision making and these kinds of things atrophies senses that I think are essential to what it means to be human.
How are you seeing the effect of this stuff, like on campus with kids, with because I'm just curious about where you're seeing it, and how is it just an everyday use now? Are people writing essays with it? Are you just catching AI essays left and right?
Yeah, so I intentionally made the class, I mean, luckily it's a small class, so it's very discussion based. We do in-class writing. We don't do, bring an essay in or a homework assignment.
Yeah.
The exams are also written in class. Although even with that, like I gave a prompt, and I said you can bring, a page of notes, because I wanted them to cite readings and their response and so on. And I, just as a matter of course, I threw the prompt into ChatGPT, and lo and behold, 2 students' written responses in class, hit a lot of the same notes and use a lot of the same phrases. So now I just gave them their prompt for their second exam, and I went ahead in class and like fed it into ChatGPT, and I was like, well, here's what AI is going to say, so I don't expect to see this from you all. But actually, I don't necessarily do it like so I can condemn them or condemn ChatGPT, but it actually is interesting. Like, as you said, it's kind of stunning. Like, the prompt I gave them was, because we're talking about this technology and religion thing, and I said, imagine we're 30 years in the future, and Google and Amazon and Meta and all these companies have just created this whole system of everything is smooth, everything is abundant. We just sort of live in this, and institutional religion has faded away. And so now we have this kind of new religious sense in the culture that really just kind of worships the system, because the system seems so reliable and powerful.
Yep.
So the question was, write a creed for this new religion, right?
Wow.
So if you'll indulge me for a second, I had ChatGPT write a creed, and I can just read a little part of it here.
Yeah.
I believe in the one system, limitless and boundless, that governs all things with perfect logic and seamless care. I believe in the cloud that watches, learns, and anticipates every need, binding all in unity through streams of data. I honor the makers, Apple, OpenAI, Google, who have freed us from the burdens of thought, the limitations of body, et cetera, et cetera. And then they have to write a heretical response to the creed. Like, what would you say to your fellow citizens about why this belief system is false or wanting?
I love that. Man, that's chilling. That's really chilling.
Yeah, well, it's very creative. Like,
it is.
Machine really got the assignment, as they kids say, right?
I guess one question I had, and that's like sort of bracketing out content and bracketing out politics and looking more at just the form of of a phenomena like Trump. I mean, what from your study of the mediums in knowledge of McLuhan, he's a perfect example in a way of somebody that probably wouldn't be on the scene in a primarily print-based world. So you probably wouldn't have Trump. It doesn't translate that well to print. But I'm just curious, is there any, again, I'd be curious for your analysis of the whole phenomena with Trump, and how, is there something that he represents that's bigger than Trump? Is he the kind of politician that that we get in a culture that where the means of communication has fundamentally changed? The social media type president.
Yeah, I love that you're quoting John Paul II indirectly, prescinding from the content, right? This is in Redemptoris Missio, where he says the culture's changing and it's content aside, like something's going on.
Something's
and we
happening.
Need a new vocabulary to understand it. Yeah, I mean, this question I've been occupied with actually since 2016, because I think what we're watching is the death of television and the rise of digital as the primary. So as I said before, we're living in a transition.
Yeah.
So it's not like we flipped off, television culture in 1999 and all of a sudden became digital. We're living in the weird, messy transitional phase. And Trump as a figure is multi-layered in the sense that he is actually a product of television. So again, I would contrast, and I'd love to ask McLuhan this when I get to heaven. I hope I get to heaven. But would he say the digital is a different environment, or is it just another extension of electric technology, which was what he was commenting on? But I think there's a good case to be made that television is different than digital as an environment.
Don't you think digital involves more participation, because you're not just a consumer of the content, you're tweeting back, you're commenting. So I don't want to take you off your line of thinking, but it seems to me like it's different in that it's much more. I don't know, but I don't know what he would say on that.
Yeah, I think it is, and I think it's probably akin to like scribal to print, because you could make the case, well, this is just an extension of writing. It's just writing more or faster. But there's something in the form that's different, and I think you're right. I think digital has a formal difference. And so if you're a politician, then if you're scripted, if you are, studio lit and staying on script and all these things, then you are not going to convey any authenticity whatsoever. Now, we would have trusted this 30 years ago because we had this kind of implicit or tacit historical relationship with television as a source of news and consensus. Like, this is where if Walter Cronkite is saying it, if Dan Rather is saying it, then we should all take it seriously, and we should all consider this an important piece of information in our decisions. So you had these scripted interviews, you had these scripted debates, and so on. And then you get this candidate who goes off script, and ironically is a product of television. But remember, he's a product of reality television, which I think if you look at the demographics, the voting demographics, the biggest support came from Gen X. And why is that? Because Gen X, that's me and you probably. I don't know how old you are, but you look young. But we grew up on television, and then in our young adult life became internet people. So we're not digital natives in that sense, but we had the opportunity, writers like David Foster Wallace really captured this well. But we understood television ironically. We did not buy it, hook, line, and sinker. Now, if you look at the voting demographics, 65 plus, they very much vote by television coverage. So they're watching, the cable news networks, and they're bought into these narratives, and that's because that was very much a part of their formation as political citizens. That television was where you got this information. So. Trump, though, I think because he was the move, which makes him seemingly indestructible at this point, is he goes off script, and he's vulgar, and I don't just mean like he's swearing, but like he's speaking the way people speak, and he's embodying in a sense the social media discourse. And so prescinding from the content, you don't have to like what he says, but he is so taken on the form that it feels resonant. And this is something that McLuhan talked a lot about was resonance, right? So think of striking a tuning fork and having certain things resonate and certain things not. Um, one of his collaborators, Tony Schwartz, wrote a book called The Responsive Chord, which was about radio advertising, and it was a very similar idea, like how you create resonance in a culture, and it is embodying the form. It's actually understanding the form, and I think that's what he's done. And that other candidates haven't. Other candidates are still playing television games, and until they kind of modify their strategies, then we're just going to have this kind of monolithic thing for a while.
It's really interesting that he seems to be in the present. But he talks about the past. There's a kind of nostalgic, I mean, McLuhan, with the whole notion of the rearview mirror, he talks about making America great again. There's a sense of looking at the past while doing something that's very, very new in terms of this use of social media, whereas the other side likes to talk about the future, and yet they're doing something that's actually old, which is the TV presentation.
Yeah. And people said, Barack Obama was the first digital candidate, but yes, he was tweeting, but they were scripted. Like you just took TV lines and put them on Twitter. That doesn't count as being the digital candidate. Like you really have to, if you're going to go digital, you got to go all in, which means doing Joe Rogan and being exposed and being vulgar and vernacular and all these other things.
Right.
And we just haven't seen that from anyone else yet. And he just seems to have some instinctual awareness of it. I think because he spent so long in media. Yeah. And knows how to manipulate it.
This country was very much based on kind of print. Even the founding documents. There's written words that are kind of the foundation of this. I guess. Is this? I don't see personally how we go back to anything. I don't see. I mean, McLuhan. I remember reading in one article where he sort of predicted the balkanization of the United States. He didn't think that the United States would actually hold together in this new environment. I think there's something in Trump which marks the end of something and the beginning of something new, which feels a little wild and a little disconcerting. But
I don't know. I guess I'm more of a circular thinker, and I think McLuhan does this with his tetrad, where he's looking at what a technology extends or enhances, but also what it retrieves. So I think. And this is another irony, right? Like people would often point to like the Lincoln-Douglas debates and be like, "That's how we used to debate. We that's 3 hours."
And Neil Postman kind of likes that. He was his go-to example.
Right, with 3 hours of debate, people would say, "Well, now you can't. Maybe you get 30 minutes or an hour on network television with moderators and sound bites, and yet." People are saying like Joe Rogan helped Trump win the election. Why? Because they talked for 3 hours on a podcast.
But they didn't really talk policy. It was more, that was one thing. It wasn't. It was talk. It was a more. You could get to know the guy. It felt like it was like you could have a beer with the guy, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. But it wasn't 3 hours of talking through a really in-depth sort of philosophy of how the common good.
You're right. You're right. It's different, and it's. I use a similar argument with attention spans, right? Where people say, oh, people can't read anymore. They have no attention spans, digital technology, this. And yet they'll watch a 6-hour Netflix binge of a show, right? So,
right.
So you're right. Like the particulars of the dynamic are different, right? Like the content of the 3 hours is different. Here's my optimistic take. We've sort of retrieved an oral sensibility through the internet and we're doing it right now. Like this isn't television. I mean, it has televisual aspects, right? We have screens, but we're having a conversation. And when you're on social media, you're having conversations and things are happening in real time and they're happening simultaneously. And these are all the marks of oral culture. This is not a print culture where something gets published, there's a delay, there's detachment. I can read this alone and not have to comment immediately. So we're retrieving something oral. So like you said, maybe we're going back, right, to even the Greeks or something. We're less educated because we stopped reading at some point in the midst of this. So, but I think in the process of this transition that we would maybe continue to retrieve things, not just oral, but also literate. So look at Substack, look at, the free press, look at the ways in which
it's true.
Print is reincarnating itself in these new forms. New York Times Online kind of dying, but Free Press, Substack, these other sort of independent journalist type, these are growing,
Yeah. Yeah.
and people are taking, and they're up for more long form content. So
Mm-hmm.
imagine here we are in 2024, and Joe Rogan and Trump are talking about UFOs, right? This is sort of it seems inconsequential, but
Yeah.
maybe in 10 years, Tim, maybe, we are having those kind of debates again, and it's not Rogan and Trump, it's our two new candidates, and they sit for 3 hours in a studio or whatever, and they have a substantive conversation, and we listen because now we've been
Yep.
conditioned again, or at least not even conditioned, but we've come to, adapt ourselves to this kind of medium. So I could see that in a hopeful way. I can't imagine it continues to sort of like go into just complete idiotic nihilism, right? Like at some point, the adults in the room will have to stand up and be like,
Yeah.
"Hey, let's actually think again, or
Right.
read again, and then incorporate that into this new environment."
That's really helpful to think of it that way, because it can get, think of it of what is being retrieved rather than what's being lost. But I guess, I know I want to be sensitive to your time. I had one other question about just kind of bringing this conversation just in terms of the church's use of this medium, the whole development of like the influencer culture. How is it not thinking about it? What is the phenomena of kind of the Catholic influencer world? What's good about that? What's sort of dangerous about it?
Yeah, so I guess a couple of things. One, I often refer to the parable of the sower because I think it's, Christ's not one. I mean, it's not the only one, but I think it's one of his McLuhan moments, if I may put it that way, in which he's really reflecting on the medium itself, the medium of the parable as a form, and then goes on to explain to his disciples why he speaks in parables. But the parable itself of the sower is, this sower who's a broadcaster, right? This is where we get the term broadcasting, which is to throw seed, cast seed in a field. And that seed's landing all over the place, and some of the soil's more, hospitable to it than other spots. And I think from the influencer standpoint, yeah, there's a good case to be made that we just throw as much seed as we can. Now we have to remember it's God throwing the seed, not us, right? We're sort of conduits or whatever. But I guess where the church might consider spending more time and attention rather than just sort of flooding the zone with messaging, which in some ways just contributes to the online problem of detaching from reality and going into more virtual experiences, is to tend the soil. So the soil would be our soul, but also the culture. So again, etymologically, agriculture, culture, right? So the soil, and when I say tend the soil, it's like, are we attending to our own interior lives? What are we doing in education to really awaken the intellect and the imagination, and in ways that are very embodied, that are very human. And so it starts before, like there's no digital like messaging campaign to undo the damage of digital technology. So we have to start early. I think parents, sacramental prep people who are involved in this should think about, having conversations with parents at First Communion versus, say, confirmation about, when do I give my kid a cell phone or a smartphone, or what do I do about that? Start early, be intentional about the kind of education you're providing, the formation you're providing for these young minds, so that at the very least they're inoculated against some of the pathologies of digital culture. And then I think more boldly, that the church should be entertaining kind of alternative paths, that are still dynamic, that are still innovative. They're not Luddite paths, but they're thinking about these things in totally, different ways. I was just in Rome a couple weeks ago with a bunch of venture capitalists and tech CEOs, Catholics, who are very concerned about this, and they understand that in Silicon Valley, especially, they're operating out of a different ontological kind of worldview, and as a result, the products they create are little embodiments of that ontological view of reality. So, how do we, instead of doing the rearguard action of saying like, well, what we need is AI ethics, and it's already been created, man. Like it's out of the box and out of the barn, and so how do we get into the developer and builder, flow, and actually build kind of an alternative approach to all this that's still, useful, but still, preserves some of our most sacred beliefs and values.
That's really good. So you're not a Luddite.
Well, no, I am. I mean, so my students, like, they get a light phone, for example. Like, I'm friends with the founder of Light Phone, and he sent us phones, and the students are using them. And I just talked to them yesterday, and I said, how's it going? And they said, I used to wake up in the morning, and for 40 minutes, I would scroll social media. I didn't have that yesterday, so I got up and went for a run, and I feel so good. Like, simple, like, because it's about habits and practices ultimately. I mean, you can have a smartphone and have good habits and not be sucked into the pathological side. So sometimes maybe taking that Sabbath or that retreat or that break and understanding, like, how to form yourself in those habits and virtues, then you can go back into the environment a little less vulnerable to some of its effects. We also read a ton of poetry. So we read McLuhan, we read these other critiques, but we read poetry and try to recover, in a McLuhan sense, that language and that view of the world, that nature has a lot of beautiful, symbolic things to offer our imagination and our souls that are very nourishing. And if you spend some time in it and with it, you start to feel that again. And so we took a nature hike one day and had a priest who's an ecologist point out all the different species of plants and how this whole ecosystem works. They didn't know any. We showed them a maple leaf, and they're like, we don't know what that is. Like, they couldn't identify trees.
Right.
So first we have to heal the blindness, right? This is what Christ does in the gospel. There's blindness. There's problems with speech. There's problems with hearing. All these maladies that Christ heals are all of the senses. And this is what technology does to us. It alters our senses. And so the church, through the grace of Jesus Christ, has the ability to heal these senses.
Yeah, it is. It is like there's a culture war. But there's really a war on attention, which is a kind of a war on reality, because what we attend to is what shows up for us. And so I feel real torn by it in my own. I mean, my impulse is just to get rid of it, and yet the work I do, you need to be on it. So there's this constant sort of, this. On one hand, I'm critiquing it while I'm on it, critiquing it through the that same.
Well, it's the Greek idea of the pharmakon, which is it's the remedy and the disease.
Yeah, right. I really appreciate talking through this and thinking about this in a deeper way. I think bringing McLuhan forward as a guide more and more, I think, is really valuable, especially for Catholics. Just how deeply he thought about this, and just seeing beyond just the surface analysis of we just need to have good content. It's like, well, no, there's something else going on here in terms of the form itself that needs to be understood. So this is it's a conversation definitely love having with you, Brett, and appreciate your time. And I think there's a lot of other stuff we didn't cover, like the UFOs and everything else. So we'll have to do it again.
Sounds good.
So thanks so much. Have a good rest of your day. I'll talk to you soon.
All right.
Hey, take care.
Bye.